The history of Egypt, complete, detailed, with facts. Prologue. The land created by the Nile. The gift of the river Egypt stands as one of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations, a culture that emerged not merely beside a river, but because of it. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, around 440 BCE, famously declared Egypt to be the gift of the Nile. And no phrase has ever more accurately captured the essence of this remarkable land. Without the Nile, Egypt would be nothing more than an extension of the vast Sahara Desert that surrounds it on both sides, an inhospitable wasteland incapable of supporting human life, let alone one of history's most advanced civilizations. The annual miracle, the inundation, the Nile's flooding cycle was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, a phenomenon so reliable and life-giving that it shaped every aspect of Egyptian life, from agriculture to religion, from architecture to philosophy. Each year, with astronomical precision, the great river would begin its transformation. Around mid-July, corresponding to the ancient Egyptian month of Akhet, the season of inundation, the Nile would start to swell with waters originating thousands of miles away in the highlands of Ethiopia and the Great Lakes of East Africa. This wasn't merely a flood. It was a carefully choreographed natural phenomenon that the Egyptians came to understand and predict with remarkable accuracy. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian observers had already begun documenting the flood cycles, noticing that the rising of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet or Sothis, in the pre-dawn sky coincided almost perfectly with the beginning of the inundation. This astronomical observation became so important that it marked the beginning of their calendar year, creating one of humanity's first accurate calendar systems around 2900 BCE. The geography of abundance. The flooding would continue through August and September, sometimes extending into October in particularly abundant years. During this period, the Nile could rise anywhere from 6 to 8 meters, approximately 20 to 26 feet, above its normal level, transforming the narrow ribbon of habitable land along its banks into a vast inland sea. Ancient Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom period, approximately 1650 BCE, describe how only the villages built on elevated ground would remain visible during the peak of the flood, appearing like islands in an enormous lake that stretched from the desert cliffs on one side to those on the other. But it was what happened after the waters receded that made Egypt possible. As the flood withdrew in October and November, the beginning of Pere, the season of emergency, left behind a gift more valuable than gold, a thick layer of rich, black, fertile silt. This wasn't ordinary mud. This was mineral-rich sediment that had traveled from the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia, carrying with it nutrients accumulated over thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, meaning the Black Land, in direct reference to this dark, fertile soil that contrasted so sharply with Deshret, the red land of the surrounding desert. The science behind the divine modern geological studies have revealed just how extraordinary this natural system was. Each annual flood deposited approximately 4 millimeters of new topsoil across the floodplain. Not much in a single year, but over centuries and millennia, This created soil layers dozens of meters deep in some areas. Chemical analysis of this nilotic silt shows it contained essential nutrients including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, along with trace minerals that would have required extensive fertilization in other agricultural systems. The Egyptians didn't understand the chemistry, of course, but they didn't need to. What they observed was that crops planted in this black soil grew with astonishing vigor. Barley and emmer wheat, the staples of the Egyptian diet, would spring from the ground and reach maturity in just 4 months, from November planting to March harvest. In particularly good years, documented in administrative texts from the reign of Amenemhat III, approximately 1860-1814 BCE, Egyptian fields could produce yields of up to 10 meaning 1 bushel of seed would produce 10 bushels of grain. This was an extraordinary return in the ancient world, where 4-1 or 5-1 was considered respectable. The divine order, Ma'at, and the flood. The Egyptians' response to this annual miracle reveals much about their worldview. They didn't see the flood as a random natural phenomenon, or even as a simple blessing. They understood it as evidence of divine order, as proof that the universe itself was structured according to principles of harmony and balance. This concept, which they called Ma'at, became central to Egyptian religion, philosophy, and governance. The flood's regularity was so dependable that any deviation from the norm was considered deeply significant. Administrative records from the Old Kingdom period, approximately 2686 to 181 BCE, particularly from the reigns of various pharaohs of the 6th dynasty, around 2345-2181 BCE, document the height of the Nile's flood each year, using devices called nilometers, graduated stone columns, or stairways built into the riverbank. These measurements weren't just practical information for planning agriculture. They were considered barometers of cosmic order itself. A flood that was too low, measuring less than 12 cubits, about 6.3 meters, at the Cairo nilometer spelled disaster. Ancient texts describe how low Nile floods led to famine, social unrest, and sometimes political collapse. The famous Famine Stela, an inscription dating to the Ptolemaic period, 305-30 BCE, but claiming to record events from the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, around 2667, 2648 BCE, describes a catastrophic 7-year famine caused by the Nile's failure to flood properly. While the historical accuracy of this particular inscription is disputed, archaeological evidence confirms that prolonged periods of low floods did occur and had devastating consequences. Conversely, an excessively high flood over 16 cubits, about 8.4 meters, could also be disastrous, washing away villages, destroying storage facilities, and arriving with such force that it damaged irrigation infrastructure before anyone could benefit from its waters. The ideal flood, celebrated in hymns and prayers, was one that reached exactly the right height, high enough to saturate the fields thoroughly, but not so high as to cause destruction. The gods of the inundation. This vital phenomenon naturally became personified in Egyptian religion. Hapi, the god of the annual flooding, was depicted as a man with a large belly and breasts, symbolizing the fertility and nourishment the flood brought. Hymns to Hapi, particularly one dating to the Middle Kingdom, around 1990-1650 BCE, describe him as Lord of the fish, who makes the birds to go upstream, and celebrate how, when he rises, then the land is in jubilation, then every belly is in joy, every backbone takes on laughter, and every tooth is exposed. The flood was also associated with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. Just as Osiris died and was reborn, so too did the land die in the dry season and come back to life with the flood. By the New Kingdom period, approximately 1550 to 1077 BCE, this parallel had become so established that the flooding of the Nile was sometimes described as the arrival of Osiris, and the black silt was called the flesh of Osiris. De voortgesser human response. Engineering the divine. While the Egyptians saw the flood as divine, they didn't simply wait passively for the gods to provide. As early as the pre-dynastic period, before 3100 BCE, Egyptian communities were already building basic irrigation systems. Simple channels and basins that would capture and hold floodwater, allowing fields to be irrigated even after the Nile had receded. By the time of the Old Kingdom, these had evolved into sophisticated systems of canal networks, documented in administrative papyri from the reign of Sneferu, approximately 2613–2589 BCE, and his son Khufu, approximately 2509–2566 BCE, the builder of the Great Pyramid. These weren't simple ditches. They were engineered waterways that could redirect enormous volumes of water across miles of territory, filling carefully constructed basins that would hold water for weeks or even months after the flood receded. The organization required for these projects was immense. In the New Kingdom, papyri from the reign of Rameses III, approximately 1186–1155 BCE, describe irrigation projects that mobilized tens of thousands of workers, required detailed surveying using astronomical observations for accuracy, and involved complex calculations about water flow, land elevation, and crop water requirements. This wasn't just about moving water. It was about creating a human-managed system that could extract maximum benefit from the divine gift of the Nile. The three seasons, organizing time around the flood. The flood's regularity allowed the Egyptians to divide their year into 3 seasons of 4 months each, a system that endured for over 3,000 years. Akhet, inundation. Approximately July to November. During this period, much of the agricultural land was underwater, so this became the season when large-scale construction projects were undertaken. It's no coincidence that pyramid construction and other massive building projects intensified during Akhet, when agricultural workers were freed from their fields. Records from the reign of Khufu, around 2589–2566 BCE, suggest that the pyramid construction workforce swelled dramatically during the inundation season. Peret, emergence. Approximately November to March. As the waters receded, this became the season of planting and growth. Administrative texts from the Middle Kingdom describe the careful scheduling of planting, with different fields being seeded in a specific sequence to ensure a steady succession of harvests. This season represented rebirth and was associated with numerous festivals celebrating renewal and fertility. Shemu, harvest. Approximately March to July, the season of harvest and low water, when the Nile was at its lowest point. This was the time of maximum agricultural activity, when everyone from peasants to temple workers was mobilized for the harvest. It was also the season of greatest anxiety, as food stores from the previous harvest dwindled and everyone awaited the arrival of the new flood. Tax collection occurred primarily during Shemu, as this was when wealth was most easily measured in harvested grain. The Nile. As highway beyond agriculture, the Nile served as Egypt's primary transportation network. The river flows north, from the highlands to the Mediterranean, but the prevailing winds in Egypt blow south. This remarkable coincidence meant that boats could sail south against the current using sail power, then float north with the current when they lowered their sails. Ancient Egyptian vocabulary reflects this reality. The word for to travel north literally meant to go with the current, while to travel south meant to go against the current, or to sail. This made Egypt extraordinarily unified for an ancient civilization. While other ancient peoples were separated by mountains, deserts, or difficult terrain, Egyptians could travel the entire length of their country, a distance of over 600 miles from the first cataract at Aswan to the Mediterranean coast, in a matter of weeks. Inscriptions from the reign of Senusret Tef, approximately 1971-1926 BCE, describe royal inspection tours that traveled the entire length of Egypt, with the pharaoh reviewing administrative centers, settling disputes, and asserting royal authority. This ease of travel had profound implications. It meant that cultural innovations, artistic styles, and religious ideas spread rapidly throughout Egypt. It meant that central governments could project power effectively from the capital to distant provinces, and it meant that Egypt, despite its considerable length, maintained a remarkable cultural unity that would prove extraordinarily resilient over thousands of years. The Delta and the Valley. Two Egypts. Yet the Nile also created a fundamental geographic division. Upper Egypt, the narrow river valley stretching from Aswan to just south of modern Cairo, was dramatically different from Lower Egypt, the vast fan-shaped delta where the Nile spreads into multiple branches before reaching the Mediterranean. Upper Egypt was a land of dramatic contrasts. The narrow green strip of the Nile Valley, rarely more than a few miles wide, pressed between towering cliffs of limestone and sandstone. Here, the desert was always visible, always present, creating a sharp boundary between life and death, between the Black Land and the Red Land. This geography shaped Upper Egyptian culture, making it more conservative, more focused on the eternal and unchanging. Lower Egypt, by contrast, was a land of abundance and complexity. The delta's multiple branches, marshlands, and networks of canals created a landscape of extraordinary fertility, but also of greater cultural diversity. The delta was Egypt's window to the Mediterranean world, and it was generally more cosmopolitan, more open to foreign influences, more dynamic and changing. This division was so fundamental that it was encoded in Egyptian royal titulary from the very beginning. Pharaohs didn't just rule Egypt, they ruled the two lands, and wore the double crown, Shent, that combined the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt. Even the gods recognized this division. Horus, the divine prototype of the pharaoh, was said to rule the two lands, just as the earthly pharaoh did. Conclusion: the river as destiny. The Greek historian Hecataeus of Miletus, writing around 500 BCE, stated simply, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile." But perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Egypt was a partnership between river and people, a civilization that arose when a unique natural phenomenon met human ingenuity, religious devotion, and social organization. The Nile didn't just provide water and fertile soil. It provided regularity, predictability, and abundance at a scale that made civilization possible. It provided a highway that unified a vast territory. It provided a calendar, a religion, and a world-view based on cycles of death and rebirth, on the balance between chaos and order, on the belief that the universe was fundamentally structured and knowable. When we examine Egyptian civilization, its incredible longevity, spanning over 3,000 years, its remarkable cultural continuity, maintaining recognizable artistic and religious traditions across countless generations, its monumental architecture and sophisticated administration. We are really examining what humans can achieve when blessed with a stable, abundant environment, and the wisdom to work in harmony with it. The story of Egypt is the story of the Nile. And as we move forward through Egyptian history, from the unification of the two lands, through the glory of the pyramid builders, from the empire of the New Kingdom to the twilight of the Ptolemaic dynasty, we must always remember that every pharaoh, every priest, every pyramid builder, and every peasant was in the end a child of the river-living, working and building their civilization in the narrow green line between the desert and the water, in the land that the Nile created. Pre-Egyptian cultures, 7,300 BCE. The foundations of civilization, from nomads to nation builders. Introduction: the long road to Egypt. Long before the pyramids pierced the sky, before pharaohs claimed divine kingship, before hieroglyphs were carved into temple walls, the Nile Valley and Delta were home to peoples whose innovations, struggles, and gradual cultural evolution would lay the foundations for one of history's greatest civilizations. This is the story of pre-dynastic Egypt, a period spanning nearly 4,000 years, from approximately 7,000 to 3,300 BCE, when scattered communities of hunter-gatherers slowly transformed themselves into the complex, stratified society that would eventually unite under a single ruler. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it inevitable. It required thousands of years of experimentation, countless failures and successes, the gradual accumulation of knowledge about agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, and social organization. It required the development of new technologies, new economic systems, and new ways of thinking about power, death, and the divine. The archaeological record of this period, painstakingly uncovered by generations of researchers since the late 19th century, reveals a story far more complex and fascinating than simple, linear progress. We see cultures rise and fall, innovations appear and spread, trade networks expand and contract, social hierarchies emerge and solidify. We witness the birth of art, the evolution of religious thought, and the first stirrings of the political consciousness that would eventually unite Egypt into a single kingdom. 1. The Merimde culture, circa 5,000–4,200 BCE. Discovery and significance. The Merimde Beni Salame culture, named after the archaeological site located approximately 60 kilometers northwest of modern Cairo in the western Nile Delta, represents one of the earliest fully sedentary agricultural communities in Egypt. The site was first discovered in 1928 by Austrian archaeologist Hermann Juncker, though the most extensive excavations were conducted between 1929 and 1939, and again from the 1970s through the 1990s by international teams. What makes Merimde extraordinary isn't just its age, though at approximately 5,400 BCE. It predates the unification of Egypt by nearly 1,500 years, but what it reveals about the earliest stages of the Neolithic Revolution in North Africa. This wasn't a temporary settlement or seasonal camp. This was a permanent village occupied continuously for centuries, with occupation layers in some areas reaching depths of 2.5 meters, indicating long-term habitation and multiple building phases. The settlement, life in the first villages. The Merimde settlement covered an impressive area of approximately 180,000 square meters at its height, around 4,500 BCE, making it one of the largest Neolithic sites in the entire Near East. Population estimates based on dwelling density suggest that between 5,000 and 16,000 people may have lived here at various times during the site's occupation, an extraordinary concentration of humanity for this period. The earliest occupation levels, dating to around 5,000 to 4,800 BCE, show relatively simple oval dwellings, partially dug into the ground, with walls made of mud mixed with straw and supported by wooden posts. These semi-subterranean structures, measuring typically 5 to 3 meters in diameter, provided protection from the elements and were likely cool in summer and warm in winter. Excavations have revealed hearths inside these dwellings, along with storage pits for grain, evidence of year-round habitation and forward planning. But it's in the later occupation phases, particularly from 4,600–4,200 BCE, that we see remarkable architectural evolution. The houses became larger, with some rectangular structures measuring up to 5 meters long and 3 meters wide. They were now built at ground level rather than sunken, with mud brick walls and possibly reed mat roofs supported by wooden beams. The floors were carefully prepared with compact mud or clay, and some dwellings show evidence of having been replastered multiple times, indicating long-term maintenance and use. The village layout shows no evidence of central planning or obvious social hierarchy in terms of architecture. Houses were scattered irregularly across the settlement area, with no clear streets, defensive walls, or public buildings. This suggests a relatively egalitarian social structure, a community where families lived in roughly equal conditions, without obvious rulers or elite classes. Agricultural revolution, feeding the community. The people of Merimde were accomplished farmers, and analysis of botanical remains from the site has revolutionized our understanding of early Egyptian agriculture. Carbonized grain samples recovered from storage pits and hearths have been identified as including emmer wheat, Triticum decoccum, and barley, Hordeum vulgare, the two crops that would remain staples of Egyptian diet for the next 5,000 years. What's particularly fascinating is that genetic analysis of these ancient grain samples, conducted in the early 2000s, shows they were domesticated varieties, not wild species. This means the Merimde people either imported domesticated seeds from the Levant, modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, where agriculture had been established earlier, around 8000 BCE, or they were part of an independent process of plant domestication in the Nile Valley. The evidence increasingly suggests the former, that agriculture came to Egypt as a package of knowledge, seeds, and techniques from Southwest Asia. Beyond grain cultivation, the Merimde people grew lentils, peas, and possibly flax, though the evidence for flax cultivation at Merimde is debated among scholars. They also gathered wild plants from the delta environment, including fruits, tubers, and papyrus, which could be processed into a kind of bread or eaten raw. Animal husbandry, from hunter to herder. The faunal remains from Merimde tell an equally important story of the transition from hunting to herding. The earliest levels of the site show a mixture of wild and domestic animals, but by 4500 BCE, domestic species clearly dominated. Cattle were particularly important, with bones from domestic cattle, Bos taurus, found in abundance throughout the site. These weren't just food sources. Evidence suggests they were used for traction, pulling primitive plows through the heavy delta soil. This would have represented a crucial technological advance, allowing farmers to cultivate larger areas more efficiently. Sheep and goats, both domesticated species originally from Southwest Asia, were also present in large numbers. Their bones show butchery marks consistent with meat consumption, and the presence of spindle whorls, small ceramic weights used in spinning thread, suggests that wool or hair from these animals was being processed into textiles, though it's worth noting that linen from flax would remain Egypt's primary textile material. Pigs were also raised, with pig bones representing about 15–20% of the domestic animal assemblage. This is significant because pig husbandry requires settled life pigs, can't be herded long distances like sheep or cattle. So their presence confirms the sedentary nature of the Merimde community. However, hunting hadn't been abandoned entirely. The site has yielded bones from hippopotamus, crocodile, various antelope species, wild cattle, aurochs, and numerous fish species. This suggests a mixed economy where domestic animals provided reliable food sources, but wild resources were still exploited when available. Technology and material culture. The Merimde culture shows a distinctive material culture that sets it apart from contemporary cultures in Upper Egypt. Their pottery is particularly characteristic simple, handmade vessels with a distinctive coarse fabric, often containing organic temper, straw or chaff mixed into the clay. The forms are basic, simple bowls, jars, and cooking pots, usually with rounded bases rather than flat ones. The surfaces are typically smoothed but undecorated in shades of brown or red. This rough pottery has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of a less advanced culture compared to contemporary Upper Egyptian societies, but this view is increasingly challenged. The Merimde pottery was perfectly functional for its purpose: cooking, storage, and serving, and the lack of decoration may simply reflect different cultural priorities rather than technical limitations. Stone tools from Merimde show considerable sophistication. The inhabitants manufactured blades, scrapers, borers, and sickle blades from flint, using techniques that produced long, regular blades. These sickle blades are particularly interesting. They show characteristic wear patterns from cutting grain stalks, providing direct evidence of harvesting practices. Some sickles were made by setting multiple flint blades into wooden or bone handles using organic adhesives. Grinding stones for processing grain are ubiquitous at the site. These include both saddle querns, large, flat stones with a depression worn into them from grinding, and handstones, smaller stones used to crush grain against the quern. The wear patterns on these stones have been analyzed to understand how grain was processed. It was typically crushed and ground into flour rather than used whole. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Merimde people manufactured small clay figurines, mostly of cattle and women. The female figurines, though crude by later standards, show clear representation of female anatomy and may represent some form of fertility symbolism. The cattle figurines might indicate the high value placed on these animals, or possibly represent early religious thought associating cattle with abundance or divinity. Death and belief. The Merimde burial tradition. The treatment of the dead at Merimde provides fascinating insights into the beliefs of these early Egyptians. Unlike later Egyptian practices, where the dead were buried in elaborate tombs often located in cemeteries separate from living areas, the Merimde people buried their dead within the settlement itself, often right next to houses or even inside abandoned dwellings. The burials are remarkably simple and egalitarian. Bodies were typically laid on their right side in a flexed, fetal position, wrapped in reed mats or animal skins, and placed in shallow oval pits. Grave goods were minimal and similar across all burials, typically a few pottery vessels, presumably containing food or drink for the afterlife, some shell beads, and occasionally stone tools. There's no evidence of the dramatic wealth differences that characterize later Egyptian burials. Interestingly, some bodies, particularly of children, were found with their heads deliberately removed and placed elsewhere. This practice, documented in about 10% of burials, remains mysterious. Some scholars suggest it may have been a way of preventing the dead from returning to trouble the living, while others see it as evidence of early religious practices we can no longer fully understand. The orientation of bodies shows no consistent pattern. Some face east, others west, north, or south, suggesting that if there was religious significance to burial orientation, it either varied by family or period, or wasn't as rigidly codified as it would become in later Egyptian religion. What's most significant about Merimde burials is what they tell us about social organization. The lack of differentiation in burial wealth suggests a relatively egalitarian society. There were no chiefs or kings buried with massive amounts of goods, no clear elite class. This would change dramatically in later periods, but at Merimde around 4500 BCE, we see a community where people lived and died as relative equals. Trade and external connections. Despite its location in the delta, Merimde shows surprisingly limited evidence of long-distance trade, especially when compared to contemporary and later cultures in Upper Egypt. Most materials found at the site are local to the delta region. The flint used for tools came from nearby sources in the delta or the Western Desert. The clay for pottery was local. Even decorative items like shell beads were mostly made from Mediterranean or Red Sea shells that could have been obtained through local trade networks. This relative isolation may have been geographic. The delta's marshlands and multiple river channels may have made travel difficult, or it may reflect cultural choice. The Merimdo people seemed content with a largely self-sufficient economy based on their remarkably productive agricultural system. However, some evidence suggests contact with the Levant. Certain stone tool types show similarities to Levantine traditions, and some pottery forms may indicate knowledge of Levantine ceramics. This makes sense, given that the agricultural knowledge base of Merimde almost certainly came from the north originally. The mystery of Merimde's end. Around 4200 BCE, occupation at Merimde appears to have ended relatively abruptly. The reasons remain unclear and debated. Some scholars point to possible climate change. There's evidence that the Sahara was becoming drier during this period, though the Nile delta itself remained fertile. Others suggest that social or economic changes may have made the large settlement unsustainable, or that the focus of delta settlement shifted to other locations. What's clear is that the Merimde culture didn't simply evolve into later delta cultures. There's a marked discontinuity in material culture, settlement patterns, and practices. The knowledge and achievements of Merimde weren't lost agriculture, animal husbandry, and settled life continued in the delta. But the specific cultural expression of Merimde faded away. Yet its legacy is profound. Merimde demonstrated that the Nile delta could support large, permanent settlements based on agriculture. It showed that communities could organize themselves to manage agricultural resources, coordinate planting and harvesting, and live together peacefully for generations. These lessons, learned and refined at places like Merimde, would eventually make possible the unified Egyptian state. 2. The Badarian culture, circa 4500–4000 BCE. Discovery and geographic context. While the Merimde culture flourished in the Nile Delta, a distinctly different cultural tradition was emerging hundreds of kilometers to the south in Upper Egypt. The Badarian culture, named after the site of El Badari on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, near modern Asyut, represents one of the most important phases in the development of Egyptian civilization. First identified by British archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson and her team in 1923–1924, and extensively excavated by Guy Brunton from 1922 to 1931, Badarian sites would prove to contain some of the most beautiful artifacts and most intriguing evidence of social complexity from pre-dynastic Egypt. The Badarian culture developed in a very different environment from Merimde. While the delta was a land of marshes, multiple river channels, and abundant water, Upper Egypt was and is a narrow ribbon of fertile land pressed between desert cliffs. The arable land in Badarian territory was typically only 2 to 10 kilometers wide, creating a linear settlement pattern along the river rather than the sprawling communities possible in the delta. This geography shaped Badarian culture profoundly. The proximity of the desert meant that desert resources, including game animals, wild plants, and especially mineral resources, were easily accessible. The narrowness of the Nile Valley meant communities were strung out along the river, facilitating north-south communication and trade. And the dramatic visual contrast between the black land and the red land, between fertility and barrenness, between life and death, may have contributed to the distinctive Badarian and later Egyptian preoccupation with the afterlife and the boundary between existence and non-existence. Settlement patterns, villages and desert camps. Badarian settlements show a pattern quite different from Merimde. Rather than large, permanent villages, Badarians typically lived in smaller communities, scattered along the edge of the desert, above the floodplain. These locations were strategic high enough to be safe from the annual inundation, but close enough to the fields to allow daily farming activities. Excavations at sites like El Badari, Hemamiya, and Mostageda, all conducted in the 1920s and 1930s, have revealed settlement remains that are unfortunately less well preserved than Merimde, partly because Badarians built lighter structures, and partly because of later disturbance. What we can reconstruct suggests small settlements of perhaps 5,200 people, with simple dwellings made of organic materials, probably reed and wood frames, covered with woven reed mats, similar to houses still built in rural Upper Egypt until the 20th century. Storage pits dug into the ground were common, lined with baskets to protect stored grain from moisture and pests. The frequency of grinding stones and sickle blades in settlement areas confirms that grain agriculture was well established and central to the economy. Intriguingly, some Badarian sites show evidence of seasonal occupation. Some scholars suggest a pattern of transhuman seasonal movement between riverine agricultural sites during flood and planting seasons, and desert camps during the dry season when pasture might have been available in desert wadis, dry valleys that occasionally carried water. This would represent an economy combining agriculture with significant pastoral elements, taking advantage of both river valley and desert resources. The Copper Revolution, Technology and Trade. What truly sets the Badarian culture apart and marks it as a crucial step toward civilization is its relationship with copper. The Badarians were not the first humans to use copper. That distinction belongs to communities in Anatolia and the Levant from around 7000 BCE, but they were the first in Egypt to use copper in significant quantities, and their copper work shows remarkable sophistication for such an early period. Copper objects from Badarian sites include pins, beads, rings, and most importantly, tools such as axes, chisels, and knives. Chemical analysis of Badarian copper objects, conducted using modern techniques like X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy and lead isotope analysis, has revealed something extraordinary. The copper wasn't all coming from a single local source. Instead, Badarians were obtaining copper from multiple sources, including the eastern desert of Egypt, Sinai, and possibly even the Levant and Anatolia. This is revolutionary evidence. It means that by 4500–4000 BCE, trade networks existed that could move valuable commodities hundreds of kilometers. It means that some Badarians had the wealth to acquire these exotic materials. And it means that knowledge was being shared across vast distances. Knowledge about where copper could be found, how to extract it from ore, how to smelt it, and how to work it into useful forms. The smelting of copper, requires temperatures of at least 1085 degrees, 1985 degrees, far higher than can be achieved in a simple fire. The Badarians must have developed or acquired knowledge of pyrometallurgy using charcoal as fuel in specially constructed furnaces, possibly with forced air from bellows to achieve the necessary temperatures. No Badarian smelting sites have been definitively identified, but the widespread presence of copper objects makes clear this technology existed. The implications for social organization are profound. Copper working required specialist people with knowledge of where to find ore, how to smelt it, and how to work the metal. It required trade networks to move raw materials or finished goods, and it required some people to have surplus wealth to exchange for these valuable items. We're seeing the emergence of occupational specialization and economic differentiation hallmarks of complex societies. Pottery, art and technology combined. If Merimde pottery was simple and functional, Badarian pottery was nothing short of spectacular. So impressive that when first discovered, some scholars couldn't believe it was genuinely from such an early period. The finest Badarian pottery, known as black-topped red ware, represents one of the most beautiful ceramic traditions in ancient Egypt, and indeed in the entire ancient world. These vessels were handmade without the potter's wheel, which wouldn't appear in Egypt for another 100 years, typically using a coiling technique where ropes of clay were built up and then smoothed. The forms show elegant proportions, tall beakers, shallow bowls, and distinctive cups with slender stems. But it's the surface treatment that's truly remarkable. The pottery was first coated with red ochre, iron oxide, then highly burnished, polished, while still leather hard, creating a lustrous surface. The vessels were then fired in a reducing atmosphere, low oxygen, and at a critical moment, the tops were inverted into ash or organic material, creating a distinctive black band around the rim while leaving the body red. The technical precision required to achieve this effect, consistently controlling kiln atmosphere, temperature, and timing, represents sophisticated ceramic technology. Some Badarian vessels also feature incised or painted decoration geometric patterns, wavy lines, and occasional representations of animals or humans. These decorative elements, while simple, represent some of the earliest Egyptian art and may carry symbolic meanings we can no longer fully decode. The significance of this pottery extends beyond mere aesthetics. The skill required to produce these vessels meant that specialized potters must have existed. People who dedicated significant time to perfecting their craft, rather than spending all their time on subsistence activities. The appearance of such items suggests a society wealthy enough to support specialists and to value beauty alongside function. Burials and the birth of inequality. While Merimde burials were notably egalitarian, Badarian burials tell a very different story, one of emerging social stratification and the first clear evidence of inequality in Egyptian society. This makes the Badarian culture absolutely crucial for understanding how Egypt would eventually develop into a highly stratified kingdom with god-kings at its apex. Badarian cemeteries were typically located in the desert, separate from settlements, a practice that would continue throughout Egyptian history. bodies were placed in simple oval pits, laid on their left side in a contracted position, generally facing west, the direction of the setting sun, which would later be associated with death and the afterlife in Egyptian religion. But it's the grave goods that tell the important story. Some Badarian burials are extremely simple. Just a body wrapped in reed matting or animal skins, with perhaps a single pottery vessel. But others are dramatically different. These rich burials contain multiple pottery vessels, including the finest black-topped red ware, stone pallets for grinding cosmetics, ivory combs and hairpins, shell and copper beads, carved ivory figurines, and occasionally copper tools or weapons. The most spectacular Badarian burials, such as those excavated at Hemamiyah and Mostagjeddah in the 1920s, contained dozens of objects. One burial documented by Brunton contained over 40 pottery vessels, multiple pallets, numerous beads of shell, carnelian and green malachite, copper pins, and beautifully carved ivory objects. This wasn't just wealth. This was ostentatious display of status even in death. Statistical analysis of Badarian burials, conducted by modern researchers using the excavation records from the 1920s and 1930s, shows that approximately 10 to even 15% of burials contain significantly more grave goods than average. This minority of wealthy burials is distributed across different cemeteries and different time periods, suggesting that social inequality was consistent and widespread in Badarian culture. What created this inequality? How did some Badarians accumulate significantly more wealth than others? The answer likely involves multiple factors. Control of trade. Those who controlled access to trade networks could accumulate exotic goods and the wealth to obtain them. The presence of non-local materials, copper from Sinai, shells from the Red Sea, specific stone types from desert sources, suggests trade was important, and control of trade routes or relationships with distant peoples could have been a source of wealth and power. Agricultural surplus. Those with better land, larger herds, or more effective agricultural techniques could produce surplus that could be traded or stored as insurance against poor harvests. This surplus could then be converted into exotic goods, displayed both in life and death. Specialized knowledge. Individuals with special skills. Copper working, fine pottery production, long-distance navigation may have been able to command higher value for their services or products. Emerging hereditary status. Some scholars suggest that by the later Badarian period, around 4100–4000 BCE, status may have been becoming hereditary. If a family controlled trade routes or possessed special knowledge that was passed down, their advantages could compound over generations. Religious thought and symbolism. The Badarians left us tantalizing hints about their religious beliefs, though much remains mysterious. Small figurines carved from ivory or modeled in clay depict humans, mostly female, and animals, especially cattle, which were clearly important. Female figurines with emphasized breasts and hips may represent fertility goddesses or spirits, or they might have been used in ritual practices we can no longer reconstruct. Stone pallets, found in both settlements and burials, were used for grinding minerals, especially green malachite and black galena, into powder for cosmetics. But the careful shaping of these palettes, often into animal forms, birds, turtles, fish, suggests they had significance beyond mere utility. By the later pre-dynastic period, elaborate cosmetic palettes would become important ceremonial objects, suggesting that this Badarian tradition had ritual as well as practical dimensions. The careful burial of the dead, with food offerings, evidenced by animal bones in graves, pottery vessels, presumably containing food or drink, and personal items, clearly indicates belief in some form of afterlife. The deceased were being equipped for a journey or an existence beyond death, an idea that would become absolutely central to later Egyptian religion. The consistent Western orientation of burials may indicate an early association between the West, where the sun sets, where it dies each day, and death, an association that would persist throughout Egyptian history. The end of Badari and transition to Naqada. By approximately 4000 BCE, the distinctive Badarian material culture began to fade, replaced by the emerging Naqada culture. This transition wasn't sudden or violent. There's no evidence of invasion or catastrophe. Rather, it appears to have been a gradual cultural evolution, with Badarian elements persisting in some areas while Naqada innovations spread. Some scholars see Naqada as simply representing the later stages of Badarian development, while others view it as a genuinely new culture. The truth likely lies somewhere between continuity in many aspects, burial practices, agricultural economy, copper use, combined with innovations in others, pottery styles, settlement patterns, social organization. What's clear is that the Badarians established crucial precedents that would shape all of later Egyptian history. Metallurgy. They brought copper working to Egypt and established trade networks to obtain exotic materials. Social stratification. They demonstrated that Egyptian society could develop significant inequality, with some individuals accumulating considerable wealth and status. Separation of the living and dead. They established the practice of desert cemeteries separate from settlements. Belief in the afterlife. They showed that the dead needed to be equipped for an existence beyond death. Artistic excellence. They demonstrated that utilitarian objects could also be beautiful, establishing an aesthetic tradition that would become characteristically Egyptian. The Badarian culture may have lasted only 500 years, but its impact on Egyptian history would resonate for 3,000 years more. The Naqada cultures, circa 4000-3300 BCE. Introduction: the direct ancestors of Egypt. If Merimde and Badari laid foundations, the Naqada cultures built the house. These archaeological cultures, named after the site of Naqada in Upper Egypt, near modern Luxor, represent the direct ancestors of dynastic Egypt. When Egyptologists speak of pre-dynastic Egypt, they are usually thinking primarily of Naqada. Every major element of later Egyptian civilization's social hierarchy, divine kingship, monumental architecture, writing, art, and religious concepts, has roots visible in the Naqada period. The Naqada sequence is traditionally divided into three main phases. Naqada Thur, also called Amratian, circa 4000-3600 BCE. Naqada II, also called Gurzian, circa 3600-3300 BCE, and Naqada III, also called Proto-Dynastic or Dynasty 0, circa 3300–3100 BCE. This sequence was first established by British Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie, based on his groundbreaking excavations from 1894–1895, and has been refined but not fundamentally altered by over a century of subsequent research. What makes Naqada extraordinary is the speed and scale of change. In the roughly 700 years from early Naqada, Y to late Naqada III, we see Upper Egyptian society transform from scattered farming villages to a militarized, hierarchical, proto-state on the verge of unifying all of Egypt. We see technology leap forward, art become sophisticated, trade networks extend to distant lands, and the first writing appear. We see, in short, the rapid emergence of civilization. Tuktasutasitta Naqada I, Amratian period, circa 4000–3600 BCE. Settlement and expansion. The early Naqada period saw significant expansion of settlement in Upper Egypt. While Badarian sites were concentrated in Middle Egypt, Naqada, my culture spread widely through Upper Egypt, from Matmar in the north to Hierakonpolis in the south, a distance of over 300 kilometers along the Nile. This expansion wasn't necessarily migration of people. Rather, it likely represents the spread of cultural practices, technologies, and possibly trade relationships. Naqada settlements were typically small villages of perhaps 100 to 500 people, located at the edge of the cultivation zone. Houses were simple structures made of mud brick, a technology that was becoming more common, or wattle and daub, woven reeds covered with mud. Archaeological excavations at sites like Naqada itself, Hierakonpolis and Abadiyeh, have revealed settlement plans showing houses clustered together, sometimes with evidence of small streets or pathways between them. The economy remained primarily agricultural emmer wheat, barley, lentils, and various vegetables, supplemented by herding of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. But there's increasing evidence of economic specialization. Not everyone was a farmer. Some people were potters, stoneworkers, craftsmen, or traders. Pottery. The black-topped tradition continues Naqada. Pottery shows clear continuity with Badarian traditions, particularly in the production of beautiful black-topped red ware. But there are innovations too. A distinctive new type appears. Red pottery decorated with white painted designs, usually geometric patterns, but occasionally showing boats, humans, animals, and enigmatic symbols. These painted vessels are particularly interesting because they represent some of the earliest Egyptian art. The boat depictions are especially significant. They typically show high-prowed vessels with multiple oars and cabins, sometimes with standards or emblems attached. These aren't fishing boats, but large transport vessels, indicating that riverine travel and trade were already important. Some scholars see these boat depictions as having religious significance, perhaps relating to ideas about journeys after death, prefiguring the later Egyptian concept of the solar boat carrying the deceased or the sun god. The pottery fabrics themselves show increasing standardization and quality control, suggesting that pottery production was becoming more specialized, with skilled potters producing vessels for wide distribution rather than each household making its own. Stone working, the beginning of Egyptian craftsmanship. Naqada. I saw dramatic advances in stone working. While earlier cultures had made functional stone tools, knives, scrapers, sickles, Naqada craftsmen began producing stone objects of extraordinary quality and beauty. Stone vessels, bowls, jars, and vases, carved from various stone types, including limestone, basalt, and alabaster, begin to appear in significant numbers. These weren't crude or simple objects, but carefully crafted pieces with thin walls and elegant forms. Creating such vessels required specialized knowledge, selecting appropriate stone, using copper tools and probably sand abrasives to hollow out the interior, and long hours of patient work. A single stone vessel might represent weeks or months of skilled labor. The presence of these objects in burials, where they serve no practical purpose, indicates they were valued for their beauty, and probably also for their rarity and the wealth they represented. Their status symbols ways for wealthy individuals to display their resources, even in death. Stone pallets for grinding cosmetics, a tradition inherited from the Badarians, become larger and more elaborate during Naqada. While Badarian pallets were typically simple shapes, Naqada pallets often took zoomorphic forms: fish, turtles, birds, hippos, requiring considerable skill to carve. These pallets would evolve in the later pre-dynastic period into enormous ceremonial objects used in royal rituals. Burials, inequality, intensifies Naqada. The burials show the pattern of social inequality intensifying beyond even what we saw in the Badarian period. While the majority of burials remain relatively simple, a body with a few pottery vessels, and perhaps some beads, a minority of burials are becoming dramatically wealthy. At Hierakonpolis, one of the most important Naqada eye centers, located in far southern Upper Egypt, modern Qom el Ahmar, excavations have revealed burials containing dozens of pottery vessels, multiple stone vessels, ivory combs and figurines, slate pallets, malachite and other cosmetic materials, shell and stone beads, and even occasional copper tools. One exceptional burial documented contained over 80 pottery vessels alone, a staggering display of wealth. The size and elaboration of graves also begins to show differentiation. While most people were buried in simple oval pits, some burials are placed in larger, more carefully constructed pits, sometimes with mud brick lining. This suggests that wealth was being invested not just in grave goods, but in the burial structure itself. Significantly, we also begin to see multiple burials instances where several individuals are buried together or in adjacent graves. In some cases, these may represent family groupings, but in others there are hints of something more disturbing: the possibility of retainer sacrifice, where servants or followers of a powerful individual were killed to accompany them in death. This practice would become more evident in the later Naqada periods, and would reach its peak in early dynastic times before being largely abandoned. Trade and external contacts Naqada. I shows evidence of expanding trade networks. Materials found in Naqada eye contexts, but not available locally, include from the Eastern Desert and Red Sea. Various semi-precious stones, including carnelian, amethyst, and red jasper, used for beads and amulets. Shells from the Red Sea, particularly cowrie shells, which were valued for their resemblance to female genitalia, and may have had fertility associations. From Sinai. Copper, probably in the form of ingots or rough tools that could be reworked. Turquoise, a semi-precious stone highly valued for its color. From the Western Desert. Ostrich eggs and ostrich eggshell, used to make beads. Ivory from elephants that still inhabited parts of what is now the Sahara, which was wetter in the 4th millennium BCE than it is today. From Nubia to the south. Ebony and other African woods, possibly gold, though gold doesn't become common in Egypt until the Naqada II period. Ivory from African elephants, various exotic stone types. Possibly from the Levant. Certain pottery forms show similarities to Levantine ceramics. Obsidian, volcanic glass used for tools, from Anatolia has been found at some Naqada sites, though in very small quantities, indicating long-distance trade networks that could move materials thousands of kilometers. This trade didn't necessarily involve Egyptians traveling to these distant places. More likely, materials moved through chains of exchange, passing through multiple hands before reaching Upper Egypt. But the very existence of these networks indicates that some individuals had the wealth to obtain exotic materials, and that there were mechanisms for moving goods over long distances. Naqada II, Gurzian period, circa 3600–3300 BCE. The acceleration of change. If Naqada I represents the early stages of Egyptian civilization, Naqada II represents its rapid acceleration.